I have a question for you this morning. Do you live in fear? Sometimes people in their conversations, I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that this is I'm afraid. They don't think about where they're going with that, but it almost communicates that we're afraid of a lot of things. And there are things that aren't so consequential that we might be afraid of, but there are some serious things that we might be afraid of. I'm afraid I might not go to heaven. I'm afraid I'm not doing enough to warrant heaven. There can be some spiritual fears that we can live in. But I'm seriously asking you that question. Do you live in fear? What are you afraid of? Are there things ever on your mind in that regard? And I have to confess that I didn't have that experience for the longest time until the last two and a half years. I've had a couple of things happen in our house. 4 things? The backseat driver is going to kibitz on me. Anyway, we're sleeping one night and we hear this crash sound, and it sounds just like a picture might fall off the wall and boom, we have tile all over the place, and so there was this huge noise, and it startled us, and we didn't hear anything else, and so I kind of wondered what fell, and walked around the house, and there was nothing anywhere. And it was like the next day, for some reason, didn't have a reason to go out the back door the next day. It was the day after. I went out the back door, and lying on the pad there, I live on a golf course. It's not an exclusive thing. It's a very, public, actually it's going downhill incredibly. But in a golf course, when they want to control where carts go, they string ropes with these 2x2 stakes with a hole in it, a metal piece stuck in the ground. Well, that thing was lying right there. One of those things was lying right there, which means some kid had come to the backyard and either threw it right at our back window, the window at our door, or above that, which is, we had this add-on, which is this huge triangular window. And fortunately, because we lived on a golf course, when we had that thing built, I didn't want golf balls coming through the window. And so that thing was Lexan, and Lexan will stop a bullet, I think. So I don't know if the kid threw it up there or at our door, and the door was tempered glass, but it boom, and it fell down there. What the vandalism. And there had been some stuff stolen from cars in the neighborhood. In fact, my car got broken into, but it was my fault. I didn't lock it, so they kind of got in there and got my iPod. I just left it in the car. So that was the beginning of what's going on. The second incident was we were woken up 4:30 in the morning. Was it 4:30 in the morning? Some young guy, he wasn't necessarily a teenage kid, bing, bing, bing on the door, ringing the doorbell, bing, 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 and we get up. Mama gets up. Somebody's knocking, ringing the bell, and there's this guy leaning in on the glass on each side of there is glass, leaning in, looking for someone. And had a conversation. The police ended up having to come, and they said, "Don't open the door when there's somebody like that. Don't open the door." And the conversation, just to make a long story short, he was drunk. He was with some other people. He actually mentioned they wanted to break into a house. All of it put together just unsettled me. So that now, because I'm 61, and I don't sleep as well as I used to, so now every little noise, I'm wondering what that is. I'll see a light reflect off a mirror. Somebody's driving around the road, and choom, a light will reflect off the mirror. And I have some fear now about somebody breaking into the house. It's a real fear. It is a real fear. And I'm wondering if you have any of those kinds of fears in your life. Maybe it's just a sign of the time. I want us to look at a text. We're going to focus on Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. This is the story of the disciples and Jesus going across the lake on their way to Gennesaret. And I want to read these verses. And before we do, has been some question about the provenance of some scriptures, whether they're actually true or real. And it's curious, some of the clues they will use to verify, yes, that has to be real because of the detail in the writing. When someone is just writing a story, they only give you the information that will move the story along. They don't give you little bits of information which would be included by someone who's an eyewitness to something. It'll say something in the story, it's really inconsequential. It doesn't do anything for the story except give some kind of information. And I want you to notice, as we read through this, any kind of inconsequential information. So it says, verse 35, on that day when evening came, Jesus said to them, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, peace, be still. And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they became very much afraid and said to one another, Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Now, in there is this little detail that only an eyewitness would have inserted. And it's the detail is Jesus is in the stern of the boat, he's asleep, and his head is on what? His head is on a pillow. And it's the kind of detail that someone would insert in a story it's inconsequential that there's this pillow there, but it's the kind of information that a real person who was an eyewitness to this thing might share. And this is what Peter would have been telling. Mark was not there with the disciples. He wasn't one of the disciples. He was afterward, but he was a friend with Peter, and Peter would have told him this. And the story is about Jesus' power. Now, verse 35 to 38, we have the storm. Now, and you need to know, the Sea of Galilee is large enough for there to be a serious storm. It is 700 feet below sea level. It's one of the lowest places on earth. 32 miles to the north is Mount Hebron, which is 9,400 feet above sea level. So there's cold wind coming down from the mountain and warm wind coming up from the sea, which would clash, and that would develop and generate some storms, which would be a regular thing that those fishermen would have to deal with on a regular basis. And I would think that they would be impressive thunderstorms and squalls. Do you think that those fishermen were used to those kinds of storms? It was part and parcel of their job, so to speak. There are things that you have to deal with that are common with every job that are negative things. And dealing with storms was something that they would deal with on a regular basis. And we have to remember, too, they aren't all fishermen who are in that boat, and there are other boats out there. You know, there's going to be several fishermen involved with that. So we read the reaction, and this storm must have been close to a hurricane level. They thought they were going to die. They can't bail the water out fast enough to keep the boat from being swamped. And you got to get that picture in your mind. I don't know how big these boats were, but there was at least a 12-butt boat, and Jesus is on the stern. And the waves are throwing the boat, and the waves are coming over the edge of the boat into the water. There's clouds above their head, swirling and lightning, and they're being drowned in thunder. I mean, this is a squall, so that they are afraid for their life. You got to put yourself in that boat to imagine what it must have been like. And what's the question that they ask Jesus? They see that he's not bailing water. What's he doing? He's asleep. I've always wondered about that. I mean, the water's coming over. How can he be asleep if he's soaking wet? And I can only imagine that he wasn't soaking wet, so I'm kind of wondering how the boat was built. But he's asleep, and his head is on a pillow. And he is asked a question. Do you not care that we're about to die? Somebody wakes him up. I think it's Peter. Wakes him up. Do you not care that we might drown? And you know the story. Jesus wakes up, and he stands up, and he gives a command of utter simplicity. There's no bracing of himself. There's no rolling up his sleeves. There's no incantations. He simply stands and says, quiet, be still. Now there's a squall going on. The wind is wailing. The water is crashing. Do you think he whispered? Peace, be still. I imagine all of them heard him say, peace, be still. Didn't wake him up, did I? He says, hush, peace. There's two effects here. Peace, and the wind stops howling. Be still, and the water becomes calm. Peace, be still. There's the waves. The wind stopped blowing. Now, that word calm means a dead calm. You know what a dead calm is? It's where the water is like mirror. You look over the railing of the boat, and you can see your face. It's like a mirror. It's reflected. So, the transition from what was being experienced to what is now being experienced was so stark that it scared the wits out of those who were on the boat. We'll deal with that in a minute. But just imagine, how long did that take? Wind is roiling, clouds are being blown about, lightning is flashing and thundering, and the waves are up, and then all of a sudden it's gone. Do you see the clouds kind of wisping away? And then they're just quiet. Got to think about that transition for just a moment. And then there's the other boats. You can see all the other boats now. You probably couldn't see them before because they were stuck and they were, up and down. You might catch a glimpse of them on the top of a wave, but now you can see them all. And they're all experiencing the same thing. And if you've lived near the water, if you've been on a cruise, you should know that after the wind dies down, the water doesn't just calm down. There's waves. For hours, there will still be waves coming up and down. It went completely flat, a dead calm. So we need to understand the power of this event. I'm curious, what comes to your mind today that is uncontrollable? Well, we would say hurricane. Is a hurricane controllable? No. I'm from Seattle, and there recently was a mudslide. You remember hearing this in the news? A whole mountain in the back of houses just came down, buried everybody there. They worked for days and weeks trying to dig out and find survivors. Some of my family who were up there have driven by, and as they've driven by, they've talked about how upsetting it was for them that they actually came to tears because of the destruction they found. A hurricane. What about an earthquake? We don't feel earthquakes here. An earthquake is uncontrollable, but it's immense power. Maybe it's a nuclear reactor. There are things that in our society that we think about that are uncontrollable. Now, ancient cultures viewed the sea as the greatest power that there was that they had to deal with. Sorry. The water is full of fury, inexorable power, and it can only be controlled by God. That's in their mind. The water that they deal with in life is the most powerful thing they have to live with. So as we look at this, there are two things that are at odds here. Either this was a blind, any storms are blind and random storms, filled with fury and violence, in and of themselves, something that doesn't care whether you are a loving person or a cruel person, something that arbitrarily happens to your life and existence. There is no hope in that kind of a storm. You only hope to survive. Or Jesus is the Lord of the storm, and no matter what's going on in this world or in your life, He's the only one that can bring peace and safety and all the power that you may need. That's what this story is about. Do you ever pause in your life to ask if God cares about your life? We notice that their conversation starts with them being afraid and probably having to yell at Jesus over the howling wind, "Don't you care whether we die? He's asleep. Don't you care?" They've seen Him do incredible, marvelous things. And here He's not doing a thing. They're about to die. They're this close, they feel, to dying. Being thrown off the water, probably drowning. Don't you care? Why aren't you doing anything to help us? So that comes to you. Do you ever think God is asleep in your life and doesn't seem to care? You're in a storm. You know that things don't look like they'll end well. This should speak to our heart. Because if you're trying to live a life of faith, but you're sinking, everything is going wrong, God is asleep, He's absent, He's unaware. In your head, you're going, if you loved us, you wouldn't let us go through this difficulty in our life. If you loved us, we wouldn't be about to sink, whether it's job or finances or relationships. If you loved us, we wouldn't be in this deadly peril. He didn't say, well, I understand how you might feel. No, He asked directly, why are you afraid? That's kind of in His face. Don't you care? Why are you afraid? Why are we afraid? I can imagine that response. Hello, we thought we were going to drown. The wind, the waves were overcoming us, and what were you doing? You're taking a nap. Why would we not be afraid? It seems like a very logical thing. We were afraid because we didn't think you cared for us enough. Maybe you could extend that to say, we're not sure if you loved us enough. Because if you did, you wouldn't let this happen to us. That's a conversation we can have today. And you've probably had in recent days, weeks, months, in your own spiritual experience. Why are you afraid? And his underlying question says, you should have known better. I do allow people I love to go through storms. But you had no reason to panic. That can be a hard thing to accept. We're in a storm. We want it to go away, so we have to wait and see what happens. We have to wait for the wind to stop howling and the seas to calm. Some people walk away from God because they can't handle nor think that they should have to deal with those storms in their lives, because that takes some serious, mature, adult faith. Is God in the storm? Is He there? Is He not in control? Do we have the faith to not be afraid? It's an important picture. That conversation needs to be embedded in your mind. Storms will come, and God is there. So the storm dissipates, and they are celebrating and sighing with relief that they're not going to die. Is that what they're doing, celebrating? No, that's not what they're doing. What does it say happens to them or that they're experiencing now? Pardon? The word there says they're terrified. They thought they were about to die in the storm. The storm goes away, and now they're terrified? How can that be? Why would they be terrified? And what does it say? Who are they looking at? They're looking at Jesus. Who is this that has control over the winds and the waves? And they're terrified. Does that make any sense? Why are they more afraid in the calm than in the storm? The storm was uncontrollable beyond belief. And here's a man who is more powerful than the storm. And there's a difference in that power. The storm doesn't love you. It's going to wear you down, destroy you. Over time, your body will give out. You'll die. It might happen sooner than you think. Tsunami, earthquake, mudslide, hurricane. Nature is powerful, unmanageable. It does not love you. But Jesus is powerful too, is He not? Nor can you manage Him. That's a big deal in their society. Actually, in the culture of the Old Testament, if you knew somebody's name, it kind of connoted that you had a kind of a power over that person. It's the basis for that initial question, don't you care? Because you can't manage Him, but He loves you. You may be in a powerful storm and not understand why, but know too, His power is immense, and so is His wisdom and His love, which is why you can have faith in that storm. Nature is indifferent to you. Jesus is filled with untamable love for you, and if you know that He loves you, you won't be afraid in the storm like the disciples were. You will know that He can love you, and bad things can happen because He is God, and He knows better than you what you need. If He's a big enough God for you to be mad at because He doesn't stop your suffering, He's also a big enough God to have reasons that you don't understand why these things are happening. In that storm, is He still worthy of your worship and your service? Is He still worthy? The storm's power is unmanageable and doesn't love you. The only place you are safe is in God's will. And because He is God, His will is necessarily beyond your notion of what He's up to. Is He safe? Is being with God a safe place? No, it's not. You may say, we're about to die. In fact, He may be calling you to be a martyr for Him at some future point. God is not safe. He's safe in the spiritual sense, because in him you'll never die. Is he safe? But he is God. He is the king. So he asks them, where is your faith? Where did it go? Is it in your pocket, strong and mighty? Can you pull out your faith and show it to me? No, you can't. Your faith is the object upon which you grasp. If you're falling off a cliff, you see, and there's a branch right there, and you reach out for that branch. Is it the quality of your faith that saves you? No, it's the branch, the object of your faith that saves you. It doesn't matter how you feel about the branch. All that matters is the branch. Who is that branch? It's Jesus. And that's what faith is. It's not, what Scripture says, we all have a measure of faith, and we tend to latch onto that, think, I'm faithful. I'll be faithful as I can. No, faith is about reaching out and grasping the object of our faith. That branch is what will save us. And Jesus is that branch. Here's an interesting thing regarding Mark's telling of this story, because he uses the account and the language of the Old Testament story of Jonah. You might do this as you go home and do some biblical homework in reading that. Both Jesus and Jonah were where? They were in a boat. Both boats were overtaken by a storm, and the descriptions of the storms are almost identical. Both Jesus and Jonah were asleep. In both stories, the sailors woke them up and said, "We're going to die." In both cases, there was divine intervention and the sea was calmed. And in both stories, the sailors became even more terrified afterwards. There's an obvious difference, though, between the two stories. Jonah says basically, if I perish, you will survive. If I die, you will live. And so what do? Off you go. You're into the water, and see you later, and thanks, but no thanks. Nice guys, huh? We don't see that in Mark's story. They don't chuck Jesus off the boat. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, one who is greater than Jonah is here. I'm the true Jonah, he is saying. Someday, I am going to calm all the storms and still the waves. I'm going to destroy destruction. I'm going to break brokenness. I'm going to kill death. Can he do that? Like Jonah, he was thrown willingly into that ultimate storm, under the ultimate waves, the waves of sin and death. He was thrown into the only storm that can actually sink us, the storm of eternal justice. The storm that wasn't calmed until he swept it away. The sight in your mind's eye of Jesus bowing his head and saying, "It is finished," bowing his head into that ultimate storm, should ever remove from you the question, God, don't you care? He didn't abandon you in the ultimate of storms. How can you think that he would abandon you in the comparatively puny storm measured against eternity that you are swept up in right now? Someday he will return and still all the storms for all eternity. Seeing him weather that storm, spikes in his flesh, you should know that he loves you, that he cares. And you will have the power in he who is your faith to handle anything in life. And how can you not know that? When through the deep waters I call you to go, the rivers of woe shall not overflow. For I will be with you, your troubles to bless, and sanctify to you your deepest distress. The soul that on Jesus has leaned for repose, I will not desert to its foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never, no never forsake. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to Thee for those in peril on the sea. O Christ, whose voice the waters heard, and hushed their raging at Thy word, who walkest on the foaming deep, and calm amidst its rage did sleep. O hear us when we cry to Thee for those in peril to the sea. Are you in a storm today? Are you afraid? Why are you afraid? Where is your faith? The next step, you have some questions on your insert. Are you prone to ask God where He is when difficulties enter your life? What sermon or truth did you hear today as God was speaking to your heart? I preached a sermon, you heard a sermon, you may have heard a different sermon. We all write our own sermons as we're listening to one. And what actions or attitudes do you think should be evident in your witness as others see you in a storm? Take a moment, reflect on that.